Thank you, Madam Speaker. And it's always a great honor to rise in this place and speak on behalf of the good people of Okanagan Lake West, South Kelowna. I want to inform you, Madam Speaker, that I will be splitting my time with the Honourable Member of Parliament from Mirabel. For the record, this C5 is not a perfect bill, and with respect, there are a few concerns I must point out. Let's start with the glaringly obvious. This bill is dubbed as the One Canadian Economy Act, and yet one of the first things we learn is that provinces and territories must provide consent on major projects. In other words, they have a veto. When you provide a veto to 13 different provinces and territories, you're not creating one Canadian economy. If anything, completely the opposite. In fact, a cynic might suggest that parts of this bill are designed to fail because this Prime Minister just spent an entire election making big promises that he had no intention of fulfilling. Why didn't you get anything built, someone might ask to this Prime Minister, who could then reply, because there was no agreement on what to build. And there, I submit by design, is a huge flaw within this bill. However, we also know this bill contains other measures, in particular under free trade and labour mobility in Canada. Taking action, or in this case, legislatively proposing to take action on internal trade barriers, which have long been a passion of mine. Now, I'll expand on that point. When I was first elected to this place as someone totally wet behind the ears as a rookie MP, I was fortunate to draw quite highly in the private members' lottery order of precedence. Now, back in 2011, before the NDP was in power in British Columbia, tourism was not under attack, and indeed we had a great many of Canadian visitors in my riding every summer. Yes. Visiting local wineries, even in those days we had over 200 of them, Madam Speaker, has always been an immensely popular thing to do, but unfortunately for visiting tourists from other provinces, they could not buy wine at those wineries to take back home with them. Why? Because there was an archaic Prohibition-era federal law that made it illegal to transport wine in person or to have shipped across a provincial border. If a longtime member of this place might recall, I proposed a private member's bill to remedy this and create true free trade in Canadian wine, or so that I had hoped. In those days, the NDP was our official opposition. Hard to believe now, I know, Madam Speaker, who looked to slow down my bill. But with the help of some Liberals, in particular former Liberal MP Scott Bryson, my bill was accelerated and passed in both this House and the other place. Immediately after, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and of course British Columbia adopted the spirit of my bill. Now, other provinces, not so much. One actually made regulatory changes to block my bill of what it had achieved. Now, I mention this because our Prime Minister has unfortunately made some outlandish statements, promises really, that, and this one I quote, there will be no interprovincial trade barriers by July 1st, end quote. He also suggested that the elimination of these internal trade barriers will create another $200 billion of economic activity into our Canadian economy. Now, I'm not certain if this is wishful thinking or willful political misrepresentation as a result of the recent election. Either way, I submit that the expectations have been created that Bill C5 will just not live up to. Cela ne veut pas dire que le gouvernement...
That does not mean that the federal government should not do everything it can to eliminate interprovincial trade barriers. And to a certain extent, I support that part of the bill. And that is why I am somewhat prepared to support it. But I must come back to the fact that there is the phrase need for consensus in the other part of Bill C5. Because even if the Liberal government enables the provinces and territories to have a veto on major projects, we must also recognize that many interprovincial trade barriers occur in the same way, exactly the same way. When one province refuses to find an agreement with the others. That's what frustrates me here. Because there's a type of ambiguous language and contradictory messages in this bill. And I should also underscore the fact that since 2015, the Liberals passed a number of bills, like Bills C-69 and C-48, which ended up eliminating a number of Canadian energy projects. The Liberals know that, but they're too arrogant to admit it. Ultimately, the Liberals have created a regulatory environment that is no longer accessible to the private sector. And instead of correcting that, which would be the obvious solution, the Liberals are creating Bill C5 to try to get around or speed up this regulatory process thanks to a new system, of course only if everyone agrees. But the exact way that that process would work remains an enigma. And I would just mention that in the past, the former Liberal government had a tendency to try to buy jobs in the electric vehicle battery sector. As we now know, a large number of these so-called investments, as the Liberal called them, completely failed. That's often what happens when a government decides to pick winners and pick losers on the basis of politics. I would also like to come to another topic that I'm also concerned about.
Months ago, when campaigning to become the new Liberal leader, our now Prime Minister flew into Kelowna, and while there, he told supporters that he would use emergency government powers to build energy projects. Now, all part of that was build, baby, build thing we heard so much during the election. And of course, in Bill C5, there is no such language about using emergency government powers to build anything. Instead, what we do here is this: there must be consensus. And of course, the NDP Premier of BC, David Eby, has already said no. He won't support any new Canadian pipelines built with Canadian steel that export Canadian oil and gas by getting it to Tidewater. He will say, however, yes to BC ferries built with Chinese steel by Chinese worker in a Chinese state-owned shipyard. Now, I mentioned that last part because none of the Chinese steel is subject to any industrial carbon tax. Unlike here in Canada, where Canadian steel remains subject to the Liberals' industrial carbon tax, on an interview with CTV Atlantic, the Prime Minister was clear that steel made by industry would be targeted for increases to offset his political 180-degree turn on the consumer carbon tax. This, of course, makes our Canadian steel more expensive, less competitive against Chinese steel with no carbon tax. If this Liberal government was truly serious about building one Canadian economy, why ignore the fact that Canadian industries need a regulatory environment that is competitive, creates incentives for investment that will lead to great paying Canadian jobs? Le projet de loi C5 rate.
Bill C5 completely misses the mark on this point. These are relatively modest measures, despite the fact that there have been ambitious promises. At least these modest measures go in the right direction, but the bill could and should have been much, much more ambitious. I would like to sincerely thank all members for having taken the time to listen to my comments and concerns. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.